As unpredictable as ultimate destiny, disasters can strike at any time, swiftly and without warning. They are major misfortunes, occurrences that cause great suffering or privation, and are usually accompanied by the sudden and unexpected loss of human life. Throughout the 20th century, Australian newsreel cameramen have recorded on motion picture film the great disasters that have befallen this nation, often at the very real risk of personal injury. They have created a permanent living record of our past, and it is from these archives that the following program has been compiled. This busy railway station is in the Melbourne suburb of Richmond, scene of what is probably the first Australian railway disaster to be recorded on film. On July 18, 1910, in foggy conditions, an incoming commuter train collided with a stationary locomotive. 9 people were killed and more than 100 injured. An essential element in the safe running of any railway network is the efficient operation of its signal system, as this newsreel item from 1933 illustrates.
Despite recent derailments, from which no railway system is entirely free, the New South Wales railways have a record comparing favourably with any in the world. The nerve centre, where each movement of every electric train is governed. All clear shows on the indicator flashed from the man in the box, and the train starts on its journey. It clears the station and back drops the indicator, a silent warning that the line is in use. In the box, the signalman guides it unerringly over a maze of crossings and points to the main line along which it is to travel. Although he cannot see the trains whose destinies he controls, their every movement is indicated on a large electrically illuminated diagram. Day and night, practically without cessation, the trains hurtle through the bottleneck at which all main lines to Sydney Central Station converge. Not for a moment do the drivers slacken speed. Their trust in the infallibility of the signal system is instinctive. They know the lives that are in their keeping are safe. Rushing over the network of metals, the train is switched to the one set of rails selected for it hours before. No possible contingency that might affect the safety of lives and rolling stock is overlooked. The flashing lights of this diagram are but an indicator to the signalman. By means of a mechanical interlocking system, the factor of human error is eliminated. Should any points or signals be in a dangerous position, the operator cannot clear that section of the line until they have been so placed as to ensure a safe passage. Not the least of the many marvels of the signal system is the automatic safety trip. If a signal left at danger is missed by the driver and the train is not checked, the trip remains raised and automatically cuts off the current, applying the brakes and bringing the train to a standstill. Little does the passenger realize the infinite precautions that are taken to ensure his safe passage. He alights at his home station without a thought of the marvel and ingenuity that has safeguarded him. Symbolic of the ceaseless vigilance of the signal system, the unwinking eye that never sleeps.
Despite the obvious advantages of a fail-safe signal system, Australia has experienced a number of spectacular accidents involving trains during the past 100 years, most of them caused by equipment failure or human error, resulting in an appalling loss of human life and serious injury. In March 1935, Sydney's North Shore line was the scene of this dramatic early morning train smash when 2 city-bound trains collided, the last 2 carriages of the first train being telescoped by the first carriage of the second. Neither train was carrying many passengers, and miraculously, only 9 were injured. 30 seconds after the initial impact, a third train travelling in the opposite direction crashed into the overhanging debris. The line was closed for several hours as rail gangs cleared the track. Passengers were again lucky to escape death in January 1945 when this train came around a bend near Maryland Station in Sydney's west, heading for the city at 65 kilometres an hour, and struck a 17-centimetre bolt which had been placed lengthwise on the rail. The leading carriage left the track, careered down the bank towards the road, turned completely around, and ripping the sides out of the following three carriages caused them to derail as well. Boys were thought to have placed the bolt on the line, and with more than 200 people on board, it was a miracle that no one was killed. 7 of the 13 people injured were admitted to hospital, the driver being the most seriously hurt. Then in June 1948, 55 people were injured when these two passenger trains collided near Cowan on the Sydney-Newcastle line. The Newcastle Flyer was ascending the steep incline from the Hawkesbury River, unaided, heading towards Sydney, when it stopped suddenly in a rock cutting because its wheels would not grip the wet, slippery track. The Cessnock Express, scheduled for 12 minutes later and being assisted up the grade by a second locomotive at the rear of the train, came around the blind bend and crashed into the rear of the stationary Flyer. The engine and 2 carriages of the Cessnock Express were derailed, ploughing up the railway track and filling the cutting with steam. Incredibly, again, no one was killed, although many passengers were injured, suffering mainly from shock and abrasions. But rail commuters were not so lucky in 1952 when in thick fog at 7 a.m. on May 7, an electric train crashed with terrific impact into the rear of a stationary train at Barella Station, west of Sydney. The collision occurred without warning as the train from Bankstown, loaded with early morning workers, ploughed into the equally crowded stationary train from Liverpool, telescoping the first carriage of the Bankstown train with the end carriage of the train standing at the station. The crash occurred with such force that the stationary train, with brakes on, was pushed 55 metres along the line. Rescuers immediately on the scene found horrific sights of death and injury. 10 people lost their lives and scores of injured were ferried to hospital. Emergency calls brought a large stream of people to the Red Cross blood bank. Volunteers continued to attend during the day. It was the worst Sydney Metropolitan Rail disaster at the time, and it seems certain that the death toll would have been higher had the carriages not been constructed of steel. Equipment malfunction was blamed for a similar accident near Sydenham in Sydney South just before Christmas the following year. An electric train crowded with workers and people returning home from Christmas shopping in the city stopped at signal lights. A second train, following on the same line, ploughed into the rear of the stationary train, telescoping the carriages of both trains, trapping dead and injured passengers in the wreckage. Wooden carriages were smashed to matchwood while steel carriages were warped and twisted. Again, emergency services were quickly on the scene, with rescuers having to use oxyacetylene torches to free those trapped. 5 people died in this catastrophe and over 200 were injured. On February 6, 1969, Australia's then famous glamour train, the Southern Aurora, left Sydney on its scheduled overnight journey to Melbourne. By daybreak the following day, it had passed through Benalla in northern Victoria and was heading south when the driver suffered a heart attack and, unbeknown to anyone on board, died at the controls. The train continued on out of control, crashing head-on into a freight train near Violet Town. 9 people were killed in the collision and more than 50 were injured. The majority of accidents involving trains have occurred at level crossings, particularly in country or outer metropolitan areas. In May 1956, the Bacchus Marsh Melbourne diesel train was involved in a fatal collision with a utility at Deer Park on the western outskirts of the city. The train was travelling at 100 kilometres an hour in heavy rain when the crash occurred. Both the driver and the passenger were killed instantly as the crushed driving cabin of the utility was dragged, wedged under the front bogey of the train for more than 220 metres. In 1957, a semi-trailer laden with cement crashed into a rail car at a level crossing near Ungara in South Australia. The rails were twisted and bent with the force of the impact, but fortunately it was the empty carriage behind the rail car that was hit. None of the 30 passengers travelling aboard the rail car itself were injured. Only the 31-year-old driver of the semi-trailer was killed, and the vehicle itself was a total wreck. In Queensland, 9 people died and 23 were injured when 3 carriages of the Midlander Express plunged through a wooden bridge at Bogentungan between Longreach and Rockhampton in February 1960. The bridge, weakened by debris in the flooded Midway Creek, collapsed after the train's locomotive had passed across safely. The generator car and 3 sleeping carriages lay twisted in the creek, where at least 3 of the victims drowned, trapped in the wreckage. But the worst rail disaster in Australia's history occurred on January 18, 1977, when the crowded 6:09 a.m. commuter train from Mount Victoria in the Blue Mountains of New South Wales crashed at Granville in Sydney's west. The train had just left Parramatta and was rounding the bend into Granville at 8:13 a.m. when its electric locomotive left the rails and hit a support of the overhead road bridge, collapsing the concrete and steel bridge down on top of carriages 3 and 4. The weight of the bridge compressed the carriages and those passengers inside to within half a metre of the carriage floor. News of the disaster soon spread, precipitating the largest response of emergency services that New South Wales has ever seen. "83 people died at Granville, and many more still carry the physical and emotional scars of Australia's most horrific rail disaster." Right from the very first days of settlement, shipwrecks have littered Australia's vast coastline. Literally thousands of seagoing vessels have come to grief one way or another in Australian waters over the past 200 years. One of the first shipwrecks to be filmed, and certainly one of the most spectacular, occurred on April the 2nd, 1931, when the Burns-Philp motor vessel Malabar, which was approaching Sydney on a voyage from Melbourne, crashed into the rocks just south of Sydney near the suburb that now bears its name. No lives were lost, and passengers and crew were safely ashore within an hour of the disaster. The Malabar went aground in the days leading up to Easter, and on Good Friday, more than 60,000 Sydney-siders flocked to watch the death throes of the stricken ship. Constantly battered by the pounding sea, she broke up within a week. Her cargo, which consisted of hundreds of barrels of beer bound for Singapore, was washed ashore, some of it finding safe haven in the homes of seaside residents. Sydney Harbour, one of the busiest waterways in the world, has seen its share of maritime disasters over the years. At 2 p.m. on February 14, 1938, the United States cruiser Louisville was leaving port after a goodwill visit to Sydney. As she steamed down the harbour towards the open sea, swarms of small pleasure craft cruised alongside to bid her farewell. One of these was the launch Rodney, which was laden with more than 100 sightseers, many of them friends of sailors aboard the warship.
We went along to the side of the boat, and we were coming at more or less right angles to the Louisville, about midway between the ship. I suppose we'd be about 30 or 40 yards from the ship, when the crowd on board more or less rushed to the side. As we were getting close, they could pick out the ones they were seeing, and over she started to list, really, and I didn't worry too much. I thought that she might right herself, but in a flash she went over, and everyone was thrown, and those jumped, and seats went, and all you could hear was screaming, and somehow or other I found myself on the keel of the boat. Well, when I got there, I could see that everyone was scrambling around me, and the only thing I could do was to hang onto the side of the boat with my legs outstretched, and I pulled in two girls on my legs, pulled them into the boat. And then there was an old woman that I got hold of and dragged her to the side of the boat. Well, one thing that I did notice was the way that the boys on the Louisville threw out all the life jackets at the moment the boat got the list, or capsized rather, and without any hesitation many of them dived from the boat, and to my mind of thinking I thought it was one of the greatest things that, well, I could ever imagine.
Survivors were brought to Fort Macquarie, where ambulances were waiting to rush them to hospital. The death toll from the Rodney tragedy had been exceeded only once on Sydney Harbour, when 11 years before the ferry Greycliff was sliced in two by the steamer Tahiti at almost the same spot, with the loss of 43 lives, many of them children on their way home from school. In January 1939, the coastal steamer Belle Bowery, swept by a giant wave, crashed onto the jagged rocks at South Maroubra, not far from where the Malabar had come to grief 8 years before. A familiar sight along the New South Wales coast, the Belle Bowery was a member of what was known as the Mosquito Fleet and was a vital unit of the state's transport network. As the remorseless power of the crashing surf continued to pound the stricken ship, it began to disintegrate, breaking its back and splintering its timbers.
A desperate race against time and tide meets with disaster at the 11th hour as the interstate passenger ship Arungal bursts into flames. She lies stranded off Barwon Heads, Victoria. Running ashore during a wartime blackout, the 5,800-tonner lay a half-mile from the shore, while salvage parties jettisoned cargo and awaited high tides to float the ship off. It seemed they would succeed. Then, at 3 o'clock in the morning, fire broke out. Mysterious was its origin. Watchers on shore see one of the most remarkable spectacles in the annals of the sea. A ship ablaze 3 weeks after she's run ashore, and within a few hours of her probable salvage. 2 of them injured, the salvage crew escaped in the nick of time. Barrels of crude oil in the cargo send the flames racing from stem to stern. Spontaneous combustion may have caused these barrels of oil to blow up, or was it sabotage? So perishes the Arungal, but new ships will arise as hammers clang in the shipyards of the nation.
Coastal shipping traffic was never thicker than during World War II, and ships were never more valuable. So it was a bitter blow when this freighter ran aground after a collision on the New South Wales north coast in early 1942, a shipwreck for which the enemy could not be blamed. But by May 1942, the enemy was starting to make its presence felt along the east coast of Australia. 5 large, long-range Japanese submarines were lurking off Sydney, 3 carrying midget 2-man subs and another a spotting aircraft. Launched from just outside Sydney Heads on the night of May 31, the 3 midget subs attempted to sneak into Sydney Harbour. One blew up as it tangled with a protective boom net, but the other 2 got through undetected. It was 10:30 at night. Next morning found the ferry Cuttable a mangled wreck. The second midget sub had eluded discovery for long enough to fire 2 torpedoes at the US cruiser Chicago, which was moored near Garden Island. They narrowly missed the warship, but one of them exploded beneath the ferry boat, which had been converted into a dormitory for naval ratings. 19 young men asleep on board the Cuttable died in the raid. Before it could escape to the open sea, one of the midget subs succumbed to depth charges and was subsequently salvaged from the harbour floor. However, no trace was ever found of the other sub. Just on 12 months later, on the night of May 14, 1943, a Japanese submarine sank the hospital ship Centaur off the Queensland coast, despite the fact that she was brilliantly illuminated and clearly displayed the Red Cross. The ship sank in 3 minutes and 268 lives were lost, including the 18 medical officers aboard. Only one of the 12 nursing sisters survived, Sister Ellen Savage, who was later awarded the George Medal for her bravery and fortitude. In 1962, the Liberian tanker Bridgewater, bound for New Zealand from the Persian Gulf and carrying 15,000 tons of crude oil, broke in two after taking the full force of a 130 km/h hurricane 320 kilometres off the coast of Western Australia. The tanker, with 32 men on board, broke her back and snapped apart just astern of the bridge, trapping 7 men, including the captain, in the bow section, which began to list badly as it drifted kilometres apart from the severed stern. Responding to distress calls, the Italian tanker Helios raced to aid the stricken ship, rescuing those stranded in the sinking bow section first before returning to the stern. With heavy seas still running and the ship's valuable oil cargo streaming out unchecked into the ocean, rescue of the remaining crew was difficult, but eventually they were all brought safely aboard Helios. Both sections of the Bridgewater sank within hours of the rescue. In the days before the Sydney Harbour Bridge was built, vehicle ferries carried traffic across the harbour between Kirribilli and Bennelong Point. When the bridge opened in 1932, the ferries were retired, but in 1937, one of them was completely rebuilt and emerged to ply the waters of the harbour as the Sydney Showboat. During the war, it served in the islands as the Kelang before returning to Sydney to carry tourists and partygoers around the harbour as the Sydney Queen. In 1972, the Sydney Queen was sold and was being towed to Manila for scrap when it broke adrift in heavy seas and ran ashore at Trial Bay, where it was eventually broken up by the constant pounding of the sea. A sad end to one of Sydney Harbour's best-known identities. In 1952, Prime Minister Menzies and Mrs Menzies arrived at Cockatoo Dock in Sydney for the launch of the Royal Australian Navy's newest and largest daring-class destroyer.
I name this ship Voyager, and may God's protecting care be over all who sail in her.
Voyager was the first all-welded ship to be built in this country, and as it moved down the slipway, no one could have predicted that it was destined to become the centre of Australia's worst peacetime naval disaster. On February 10, 1964, Voyager was involved in night exercises off the New South Wales coast near Jervis Bay, when it was rammed by the flagship of the Australian fleet, the aircraft carrier HMAS Melbourne. Voyager was cut in two by the force of the impact and quickly sank. The disaster took 82 lives, all from Voyager, including its commanding officer, Captain Stevens. The controversial findings of the inquiry and 2 subsequent royal commissions saw HMAS Melbourne completely absolved, while the Voyager was held solely responsible since it did not take evasive action but persisted on a collision course. Australian aviation has a distinguished safety record. The small number of major accidents is particularly remarkable when weighed against the density of airline traffic and the even greater number of flights of small aircraft used both privately and commercially. From the very early days of aviation, there have been accidents involving aircraft. The pilot and 2 passengers died when this Avro biplane crashed into the backyard of a Port Melbourne home in 1921. By the 1930s, airlines had become established and were flying larger planes capable of carrying more passengers on their interstate routes. One such plane was the Southern Cloud, a three-engine Fokker operated by Charles Kingsford Smith's Australian National Airways. On March 21, 1931, it took off from Sydney on a scheduled flight to Melbourne with 8 people on board and disappeared. Despite an intensive search, no trace of the aircraft was found until 27 years later, Tom Saunter, a young carpenter working on the Snowy Mountain scheme, came across the wreckage while on a photographic expedition in the rugged Toolong Range, 32 kilometres from Cabramurra. 2 years later, the remains of the 8 victims were finally laid to rest in a common grave at Cooma Cemetery. Then, on February 19, 1937, the Airlines of Australia, Stinson, City of Brisbane, left Brisbane at 1:30 in the afternoon on a regular flight to Sydney with 5 passengers and a crew of 2 on board. It never arrived, having crashed into the McPherson Range near the Queensland-New South Wales border. Incredibly, 3 men survived the crash, but they found themselves in a desperate situation, facing death from hunger and exposure. One of them set off into the bush to seek help, but fell to his death down a waterfall. It took the determination of a young bushman named Bernard O'Reilly, who after more than a week of searching in the remote wilderness, found the mangled aircraft and the 2 remaining survivors, Binstead and Proud.
I heard the reports from the Hawkesbury area had been contradicted, and as the McPherson Range is the most dangerous flying country between Brisbane and Sydney, I naturally thought to look there. Well, when I came within, say, 25 yards of the plane through the jungle, I saw the top chopped off a tree, and then I saw another tree all charred with flames. And then I saw the very top of the flame, the plane and one crippled wing.
Yes?
And immediately after, the 2 men called out to me.
In what condition did you find the survivors?
I found them in very good heart, but looking very bad. I didn't tell them that. But one chappie was writing his last message on a sheet of metal, and within 5 minutes he was asking me what the cricket score was. I wasted no time in whipping up a bit of brandy and egg and pouring it down the mouths of these 2 chappies.
In what kind of country did the plane crash?
Probably the worst on earth. Straight up and down mountain stuff about 3,000 feet high, sheer cliffs on either side, and dense lawyer vine jungle.
Well, then you found the men, and I understand you made them comfortable.
As comfortable as possible under the circumstances, which means that I gave them what little bit of bread and butter I had left, and I made them a little drop of tea. And I think I gave Mr. Benstead my jacket. I dashed off then for help, picking out about half a dozen men whom I knew to be very reliable. We got the doctor and a few supplies and rushed back up the gorge to get back to these men.
Through the cold and mist, rescuers struggled with the stretchers on which the 2 survivors were carried. Working in 15-minute shifts, the 80 men toiled through the rugged mountains to bring Binstead and Proud back to civilization, where an ambulance was waiting to take them to hospital. Endurance and courage beyond belief, and a classic story of survival. Commercial aviation during World War II was virtually non-existent, but it soon became apparent that supremacy in the air was essential for victory, and by 1943, the Allies were rapidly gaining the lead. Australia's newly formed aircraft industry was turning out Beaufighters, a high-speed aircraft with heavy firepower. But as with all types of planes, there were training mishaps. Watch closely as the newsreel cameraman captures this spectacular accident as 2 Beaufighters collide during a flypast over the sea off Jervis Bay. Both crews were killed in the tragedy, and the film was censored and not seen publicly until after the war. On March 10, 1946, and ANA Douglas DC-3 left Hobart on a flight to Melbourne with 21 passengers and a crew of 4 on board. Just after takeoff, the plane crashed into the sea off 7 Mile Beach. The aircraft came down a few hundred metres from shore and there were no survivors. It was the worst disaster in the history of Australian commercial aviation to that time. ANA was to suffer another blow to its safety record in 1948 when on September 2 their DC-3 Lutana took off from Brisbane at 5:30 p.m. on what was expected to be a normal flight to Sydney with 10 passengers and 3 crew aboard. At 7:53, it radioed Sydney Control that it was flying over Williamtown at 1,800 metres and was given permission to come down to 1,200. The plane was due in Sydney at 8:40, but it did not arrive. As Airport Control desperately tried to regain contact, all planes flying north were asked to keep a lookout, but Lutana had vanished. Search planes were in the air at dawn the next day, flying a triangular search area mapped out west and south of Williamtown. The search was extended to sea, following reports from a collier that a plane was flying low over the water. The trained air crews scoured the sea and the coastline all day, but there was no sign of Lutana. At the time Lutana reported itself over Williamtown, it was in fact more than 160 kilometres to the northwest near Quirindi, where within 20 minutes after its last message, it crashed into a mountainside. As the organised search had failed to find any trace of the Lutana, Captain J.C. Patterson, an East West Airlines pilot flying from Tamworth to Sydney, followed a hunch that Lutana might have been off course and crashed into Barrington Tops. So he flew east of his normal course and found the missing aircraft. It had crashed into the side of the highest mountain in the area, which was uncharted on aviation maps. Rescuers found it tough going scaling the 1,400-metre mountain. The country was rough and it was an 8-kilometre climb from the foot. They arrived at the crash scene to find that Lutana had completely disintegrated on impact. It had hit the mountain at 240 kilometres an hour and burst into flames, killing all on board instantly. As the grim procession began down the mountainside with the bodies of the passengers and crew, questions began to be asked. Why was the pilot so far off his course? And why was the 1,400-metre mountain uncharted on civil aviation maps? The Prime Minister ordered a full open inquiry into the disaster, and a special newsreel item was produced in an attempt to re-establish confidence in a public that was starting to question the safety of flying.
The Lutana disaster throws the spotlight on safety in flying. In these exclusive pictures, Cinesound takes you behind the scenes to show just what measures are taken by Civil Aviation Control of flying to protect the travelling public. Weather information is all important. Teleprinter reports come into Kingsford Smith Control Tower and are transferred by meteorological officers to detailed weather maps. Every 3 hours, a new map is drawn. Here is shown temperature, humidity, and other weather conditions at heights of 5, 10, and 18,000 feet. A falling barometer means as much to the pilot as it does to the seaman. Serviceability of all airfields and navigation aids is shown to pilots on this board. Coloured discs indicate the condition of all airfields, including emergency fields on his route. Nothing is left to chance. The pilot makes out his flight plan, stating his proposed course, speed, and altitude. The flight checking officer studies it, gives him a clearance. Check and double check. The plane is serviced, the crew briefed, it's time for takeoff.
Tower from Terrible Dog. Am I clear to taxi out for takeoff, please? Over.
Terrible Dog, clear for takeoff, over.
Let's follow this plane from Sydney to Brisbane, flying the same path in reverse the Lutana should have taken. Heading north, clear of the airport, the pilot is directed by approach control radio for the first 60 miles, and he soon lets his automatic pilot take over.
Sydney Radio, this is Terrible Dog. My position is Homer 1130, in cloud at 10,000.
Now air traffic control has him under its wing, and the pilot radios his position, altitude, and weather. His report is received in the control room and is checked on the radoniscope. This quick, easy and accurate method of estimating a plane's position, speed and height is now used throughout the world. It was invented by an Australian, Mr. Norman Radoni. As soon as the pilot's report is checked, the plane's position is changed on the air traffic board. This, together with a radoniscope, traces the movement of every aircraft leaving Sydney and keeps their position constantly under review. Estimated times of arrival are chalked on the flight information board, as control officers in the radio room receive information of position and speed. The radio beam literally guides this plane north, and here's how the system works. The beam provides a continuous radio path for the plane to follow. It's 5 miles wide at its extremity, getting narrower near the transmitting station. The pilot is center on his course when he hears a continuous radio signal. If he veers to seaward, he gets a continuous dot warning. On the landward side, an interrupted dash warning. It is obvious the Lutana could not have been flying on this beam when she crashed. Now Brisbane approach takes over, issuing instructions, late weather information and any other reports the pilot may need. The eyes and ears of radio are guiding him to his destination. It's getting dark, but flying by instruments presents no problems. At the airfield, radar plots the plane's course to the runway long before the aircraft itself is sighted. The moving dot is the actual plane. And there's Brisbane. Another routine flight completed without incident. Another crowd of passengers and freight flown in safety. Skilled pilots, modern aircraft, scientific instruments, radio and radar. These are the weapons fighting for safety along Australia's commercial air lanes.
But tragedy continued to plague ANA when in June 1950, their Skymaster Amana, once the proud flagship of the ANA fleet, crashed in thickly wooded country near York, 74 kilometres from Perth. 28 people died in this disaster, but there was one survivor whose escape from the smouldering wreckage of the aircraft was nothing short of a miracle. To further allay the public's concern about air safety, ANA showed their staff practicing procedure in the event of a crash at sea. As a self-inflating life raft was thrown into the water, help was sought by means of a hand-powered transmitter with a box kite aerial. In October 1954, crowds gathered at Melbourne Airport to welcome Australia's newest airliner, TAA's Vickers Viscount John Batman. But just 2 weeks later, before the Viscount could begin regular passenger services, it crashed 100 kilometres from Melbourne while on a training flight and lay a smouldering ruin. 3 leading TAA pilots, all of whom were in the cockpit, lost their lives in the crash. But amazingly, 5 others on board were able to scramble to safety from the cabin seconds before it burst into flames. It was a tragic setback to the beginning of a new era in Australian civil aviation. But the most incredible story of survival concerns the 27 passengers aboard the East West Airlines DC-3, which took off on a night flight from Sydney, bound for Tamworth, in November 1957. Just as the plane reached 120 metres, one of its engines failed, and the pilot, Captain McKillop, crash-landed the plane in a shallow lake on the nearby Lakes Golf Club. Rescuers were on the scene in minutes, pulling passengers through escape hatches to safety. Aided by spotlights, car lights and torches, nearby residents plunged into the water to help passengers ashore. Fire brigades and ambulances raced to the scene to handle the emergency, but they weren't needed. No one aboard the plane was injured. The only casualty was the aircraft itself. In 1959, TAA began replacing its aging DC-3s with a sleek new aircraft from the Netherlands, the Fokker Friendship, the first of which, named Abel Tasman, arrived at Mascot to a rousing welcome from a group in Dutch national costume. But on June 10, 1960, Australia was stunned to hear that the able Tasman had plunged into the sea off Mackay in Queensland with the loss of all 29 on board. This was to be TAA's first fatal passenger accident in 13 years of operation, and the first fatal accident in the world to involve a Fokker Friendship aircraft. Not all peacetime aviation disasters have involved civilian aircraft. In 1946, patients at Sydney's Lewisham Hospital had a lucky escape when a Royal Navy Firefly plane crashed into the hospital's boiler house, narrowly missing operating theatres and wards. The plane's navigator and 2 young hospital workers were killed in the crash, the pilot having bailed out as the aircraft plummeted out of control towards the ground. A jammed rudder was allegedly the cause. Fire brigades quickly extinguished the blazing ruins, while hospital nuns calmed hysterical patients. Then, in February 1959, an RAAF Neptune bomber took off from Richmond Air Force Base in New South Wales on a routine test flight before leaving for New Guinea. A few minutes later, it caught fire and crashed, killing all 8 men on board. The pilot had notified Richmond that the plane was on fire. He was trying to return to the base to land the aircraft when the starboard wing suddenly burnt through and fell off. The plane rolled over in the air and crashed on the bank of the Hawkesbury River. Experts agreed that if the wing had held for just a few seconds longer, those on board would probably have been saved. The crew did not bail out as they expected to be able to land the plane intact. This disaster was the second worst in the peacetime history of the RAAF. Sydney Road, Balgowlah, a northern suburb of Sydney, resembled a battlefield in March 1947 when this double-decker government bus, packed to capacity and heading for the city, hit a rise in the road, skidded and overturned. Fortunately, no one was killed, but most of the 73 people on board were injured, 16 of them seriously. Then in May 1949, just 2 kilometres closer to the city, another tragedy occurred involving a government bus from the northern beaches. As it travelled down the steep incline towards the northern end of the Spit Bridge, the bus suddenly veered to the left and plunged out of control through a safety fence, crashing 6 metres into the gully. The upper deck was crushed and body panels were beaten in as the bus came to rest in dense lantana bushes, rocks and mud. 4 women died in this tragedy, one of them an expectant mother, and 33 were injured in what was Sydney's worst bus crash at the time. One of the most spectacular, if not serious, accidents occurred in January 1958 when this tram skidded out of control on rain-soaked tracks and plunged nose first into Sydney Harbour near Taronga Park Wharf. No one in the tram was injured, even though it ploughed through a 3-metre earth buffer and stopped only when it hit huge rocks near the water's edge. It knocked this car into a stationary tram at the terminus, injuring the 2 occupants of the car. But tragedy struck again in 1962 when a tourist coach carrying 26 passengers plunged over a cliff on the Jenolan Caves Road in the Blue Mountains west of Sydney. As the bus paused on the narrow road to let another vehicle pass, the ground beneath gave way. As it hurtled downwards, the bus somersaulted 8 times, snapping trees in two and ripping others up by the roots before coming to rest poised on the top of a 150-metre drop. As heavy mist swept down from the mountaintops, police, ambulance men and volunteers raced to help the injured, many of whom were trapped in the twisted coach. 3 of those on board the bus died instantly. 23 were injured, 5 of them critically. 1 of them later died in hospital, bringing the death toll to 4. A day's outing that ended in tragedy. The 1970s saw 2 major disasters involving bridges, which shocked and dismayed the nation. The Westgate Bridge over Melbourne's Yarra River, the largest of its kind in the Southern Hemisphere, was under construction in 1970 when suddenly and without warning, a 135-metre section of the bridge collapsed, killing 31 men. 2,000 tonnes of steel and concrete came down as one of the main spans crashed to the ground, some of it falling on workmen having their lunch below. The bodies of others who were on the bridge when it collapsed lay below the water in the twisted wreckage of the span. It was the worst disaster of its kind in Australia and was subject of a royal commission. In August 1964, Hobart's long-awaited link between the east and west banks of the Derwent River opened to traffic. The Tasman Bridge, described at the time as a masterpiece of engineering design and construction, was a vital artery in the life of the southern city. But at 9:27 on the night of January 5, 1975, the bulk carrier Lake Illawarra slammed into the bridge, destroying 2 piers, damaging others, and bringing 3 spans of the roadway hurtling into the river, sinking the ship and its 10,000-tonne cargo of zinc concentrate. Several cars were on the collapsing spans at the time, and 5 people lost their lives as their cars fell from the bridge into the river. Daylight the next morning revealed the full tragedy of the disaster. Some people had remarkable escapes as their cars teetered on the brink of the severed motorway. It would be 2.5 years before the Tasman Bridge was restored and open to traffic again. It's not often that news cameramen are on the spot to film a disaster as it happens. In 1938, this race at Pembroke Speedway near Penrith, west of Sydney, was underway, and Cinesound were filming the event as a segment for their weekly newsreel, when suddenly this racing car went out of control and careered into a group of spectators standing on the sidelines. 4 people died in the tragedy and 10 were injured. The spectacular footage of the crash was later used as evidence at the coroner's inquiry into the accident. All 9 people at Cunama Hut on the snowfields of Mount Kosciuszko were engulfed as an avalanche of snow and rock roared down the mountainside from Mount Clark in July 1956. The giant snowslide swept the tiny hut from its foundations, crushing a 20-year-old woman to death and leaving 8 others who were also sheltering in the hut for the night, shocked and bruised. A rescue party trekked 5 kilometres through a blinding blizzard to retrieve the woman's body and to bring the injured back to the safety of the Kosciuszko chalet. October 1961 saw disaster high above the streets of central Melbourne. Seconds after the whistle blew at 7:30 a.m. to start work on the partly built Colonial Mutual Life Assurance building at the corner of Collins and Elizabeth Streets, this 30-tonne crane collapsed, crashing several floors before coming to rest, a mass of twisted steel wrapped around the main horizontal girders of the building. 3 riggers were killed as the crane fell, and several others were injured. For more than a century, men have ventured beneath the Earth's surface to mine coal. Working only with picks and shovels in appalling conditions, they could move tons of coal in a single shift. When the mechanical revolution came to the coalfields, it made life a little easier for the miners. Electric coal drills, scoops and trains now did most of the physical work. But it was still cold, damp, dirty and dangerous. Considering the precarious nature of the industry, there have been mercifully few major disasters involving mines. In 1937 at Wonthaggi on the Victorian coalfields, 13 miners died as 2 explosions ripped through shaft number 20, 200 metres below the ground. Rescue squads were quickly on the scene and prepared to enter the mine. As a safeguard, birds were used to give them early warning of the presence of toxic gas. As the squad descended into the unknown danger, the miners' wives and families waited anxiously for news. As the men returned to the surface, their faces told the story. For the men trapped below, there was no hope. They had all been entombed by the explosions. Nearly 40 years later, at Kayanga in central Queensland, 13 miners died in tragically similar circumstances. And in 1994, at BHP's Maura coal mine, also in central Queensland, 11 miners lost their lives in an underground explosion. Dangerous levels of gas hampered rescue efforts at Maura, and when a second, more powerful explosion occurred, a decision was taken that the mine should be sealed. Fortunately, not all mining disasters involved loss of life.
Fire rages through all workings of the Cessnock No. 2 colliery, breaking through on the surface of farmlands. The fires are blanketing the district with a pall of black acrid smoke, covering everything with a fine layer of soot. Heavy rains caused a subsidence over a sealed-off mine section, which, by providing a supply of oxygen, started the fire through internal combustion. With rope safety belts, miners and firemen work desperately to blow in the sides of craters so that the soil will seal off underground shafts which act as air tunnels. But as fast as the fires are sealed off in one place, they break out in another. Craters and fissures already cover an area of more than 5 acres. Onlookers are kept at a safe distance, but the miners take refreshments right in danger areas. At one stage, aerial bombing was considered as a means of sealing off. The seams of coal are only 35 feet below the surface, and the burning gas roars forth in fierce, swirling bursts. In a grim battle between men and the forces of nature, man is facing overwhelming odds, but he doesn't give up.
In 1953, at Pellor, Maine, also on the Newcastle coalfields in New South Wales, houses crashed into a deep fissure that opened up when the earth over the old mine shaft subsided. Preceded only by a rumbling noise, the ground sank without warning, sending residents fleeing as their houses sank into the craters, some of which were 12 metres deep. An area of about 3 hectares was affected. The sinking earth caused a blast in the mine, and had it been a working day instead of a Sunday, scores of miners in nearby pits might have been killed. As it was, several families were left homeless as houses hung at dangerous angles with cracked walls, twisted floors, and some with their roofs torn off. It seems that nothing inspires the public's imagination more than the sight of fire engines racing through city streets to attend a fire. Despite the obvious danger and tragedy associated with the loss of property, and in some cases human life, crowds of onlookers will always flock to the scene of a fire to watch fascinated as firemen work frantically to extinguish the blaze. Australian cities have seen many destructive fires during the past 100 years. Spectacular blazes that have caused devastation and suffering, the total cost of which has been incalculable. A tiny electrical fuse was blamed for Melbourne's largest fire in 40 years, when the government cool stores at the Victoria Docks erupted in flames in 1937. 80 firemen fought desperately to contain the blaze, but high winds hurled blazing debris onto the decks of ships moored beside the wharf. 6 ships caught fire, but firemen were able to save them all before turning their hoses from the decks of the ships onto the smouldering wharf. In 1944, it was Sydney's turn. More than 100 firemen fought this blaze which threatened widespread destruction. The 120-metre wharf shed near Circular Quay, packed with bales of cotton and art paper, caught fire and within a matter of minutes was burning furiously from end to end. With no hope of saving the building or its contents, firemen concentrated on stopping the spread of the inferno. Ships alongside the wharf were quickly moved, one with a deck life raft ablaze. So intense was the fire that it took just half an hour to reduce the huge shed to a burnt-out shell. This spectacular and ferocious blaze, which became known as Sydney's Great Wool Store Fire, completely destroyed the 7-storey New Zealand Loan and Mercantile Wool Store at Ultimo in August 1946. The building suddenly burst into flame in the early evening, and firemen arrived at the scene to find the store completely engulfed. Thousands of curious onlookers gathered to watch the awesome conflagration as residents from nearby homes were quickly evacuated. It was one of the most dramatic fires Sydney had ever seen. As the walls of the building collapsed into the street, flames jumped across into an adjacent building, setting fire to bales of wool stored inside. By morning, only a gutted shell remained where the previous day a building had stood worth £100,000, containing bales of wool valued at £200,000. 30,000 people watched as fire raged through the Melbourne Aquarium in 1953. Flames spread quickly and threatened to engulf the entire exhibition building. Glass tanks in the aquarium shattered in the inferno, spilling rare and valuable fish into the flames. Valuable birds were also lost, although hundreds were released in time and flew to safety. The aquarium seals saved themselves by diving into their pool and surfacing only to get air. The fire caused damage estimated at £130,000 and left the popular tourist attraction in ruins. There was not much left to salvage when this blaze destroyed 5 classrooms at the Nunawading South School, 21 kilometres from Melbourne in 1960. The tragedy of this fire was that it was started by 3 boys, the youngest of which was only 3 years old, who broke in and set a pile of papers alight. A school inferno started by youngsters too young to attend school. In what was Sydney's most potentially dangerous blaze, the Hunters Hill storage depot of Mobil Oil Australia caught fire in 1964, sending billowing clouds of smoke into the sky that could be seen for 160 kilometres. It was the city's biggest oil fire, and firemen from 14 brigades fought desperately to stop the flames spreading to the huge tanks holding 180,000 litres of high-octane aviation fuel. As the inferno raged through 9,200-litre drums, hundreds exploded, many of them landing in the Parramatta River. At the height of the fire, flames licked around a 45 million-litre fuel tank, but firemen poured thousands of litres of water and foam into the raging fire and were able to prevent what undoubtedly would have been a major disaster. But nothing firemen could do would have prevented the tragic deaths of 29 men when fire erupted at the Salvation Army's William Booth Hostel for Men in Melbourne's Little Lonsdale Street in 1965. Confined mainly to the upper stories of the building, the fire gave off dense clouds of smoke, and of the 29 who died, most were suffocated, the others succumbing to the flames. Firefighters and men of the Civil Disaster Squad were compelled to wear respirators during the rescue operation. Many of the victims died because they were too old or incapacitated to help themselves. Cause of the fire was a smouldering cigarette dropped by one of the men as he fell asleep. A tragic night for the homeless men of Melbourne. Bushfires have always been part of the Australian scene, sometimes induced by spontaneous combustion, but more often by man's carelessness. Bushfires have taken more human lives than any other natural disaster in Australia. All Australian states have experienced the devastation of bushfires at one time or another. The blazing horror sweeps through timbered areas and adjacent communities with terrifying ferocity, leaving nothing but destruction and despair in its wake.
Driven by a 50-mile-an-hour gale, fire sweeps huge tracts of the state of Victoria, leaving death and havoc in its wake. 20 people died beneath searing walls of flame. Hundreds were burned and injured. Stock losses were appalling. Nearly 500,000 sheep and thousands of cattle and horses met death in the raging inferno. Farmhouses burn and dozens of unfortunate families see all their worldly possessions reduced to ashes in a matter of minutes. It is a disaster of the first magnitude. Damage is estimated at £2 million. First outbreak was in the Everton district of the state's northeast. Weary settlers fought the blaze day and night, but it was a losing battle. Army walkie-talkies kept firefighting sections in constant touch and made it possible to move reserves rapidly to newly threatened points. That kind of organization brought the fire under control and saved Beechworth. It is the only kind of organization that will defeat the bushfire menace in this country. Everton railway station is a blackened ruin. Fire swept down on the little town and almost completely engulfed it. The tragedy of sudden loss of what they'd given half a lifetime to accumulate. Blackened ruins which a few hours ago were pleasant, comfortable homes. And everywhere, mute reminders of what has been lost. Grass as well as forest fires did great damage in the northeast. Tragedy struck this fire truck which loaded with 7 men was dashing for safety. All 7 were severely burned. 3 of them died of their injuries. Aftermath of a grass fire, a blackened countryside on which nothing lives. With a gale behind it, fire sweeps through scrub and tea tree at Beaumaris on Port Phillip. Magnificent efforts were made to stem the red tide, but they were unavailing, and 100 houses were gutted. Authorities estimate that more than 1,000 homes were destroyed altogether by the fires. Women and children took refuge on the beach. ARP workers did a grand job, and civilians offered splendid cooperation to the firefighting services. The most devastating grass fires in the history of the state swept through the western districts. Grass was high after a good season, but extremely dry. The fire tore through it as if it had been petrol-soaked. In the 1,000 square miles enclosed by Linton, Skipton, Cressy and Rakewood, hardly an unburned farm or paddock can be found. These are not pretty pictures, but they're published in all their stark horror, because only by the truth of bushfire devastation can the criminal insanity of carelessness with matches, unattended campfires, and hot clinkers from gas producers be forced upon the consciousness of an unthinking section of the public. And in recoiling from them, it is as well to remember that 20 human beings died in that tragic conflagration. Cameramen sent in scores of such shots, but they're all alike, the same horrible story of death and destruction. Many scenes were too pitiful to record. Maimed and blinded sheep waiting death at the hands of the humane killers authorities sent into the area. Almost certainly this national calamity was caused by carelessness. Surely the tragic panorama of death and devastation sounds a warning. For the next time it may not be 20, but 200 human lives and untold property sacrificed because of a fool with a match.
The worst bushfires in Australia's history. Fires that caused damage estimated at £2 million. The sun is almost blotted out by smoke and temperatures rise above the century. The Pacific Highway is cut north of Sydney as firefighters battle a blaze which destroys 2 homes and a factory near Woy Woy. Swept by strong winds, the flames race through the tinder-dry bush. Everything in its path is doomed. At Hornsby, a Sydney suburb, fire sweeps up from the bush and 8 buildings, including 2 schools, are destroyed. For 10 terrible minutes, the fire rages, causing £10,000 damage every minute. This 8-roomed home, owned by a former Shire councillor, is a total loss. There's no hope of saving the buildings, but volunteers risk their lives to save furniture and some possessions. Something rescued, but still the fire sweeps on. Timber yards go, a scouts hall, other small buildings, and the Anglican church. And then firemen rush to meet a new peril as the flames race into the grounds of two Hornsby schools. The Hornsby Girls' Primary School and Kindergarten are the first to go, burned to rubble in a matter of minutes. Where there are no hoses, wet bags beat out the flames, and all hoses are needed urgently at the Home Science School, where 2 blocks are blazing furiously. And then, the worst disaster of all. At Lura and Wentworth Falls on the Blue Mountains, a fire races up the valley without warning and strikes with merciless speed. This is one home in its path, one of nearly 150 houses and shops destroyed on a day the people of the mountains will never forget. Through the bush and into the towns, fanned by strong winds, home after home is swallowed up in flames as the fire leaves a blackened trail of devastation. Families flee in terror with no warning, no time to save anything. The all-destroying fire is out of control. Service stations like this one at Wentworth Falls are gripped by fire before cars can be driven to safety. And now chimneys stand like monuments among the rubble. Monuments to what were homes this morning and tonight are fiery torches. There's no stopping the fire now. Home after home, street after street, first Lura, then Wentworth Falls. A bushfire invades the towns in a crazy orgy of destruction. The smallest dwelling, the biggest guest house, nothing can withstand the fury of fire, and night brings only new horror. And here's the scene at daylight. A scene of such devastation that police at Lura said that the town looked as though it had been bombed. The fires have destroyed 102 homes at Lura and left others untouched. From the air, it's like a chessboard of horror. "500 people are homeless below us. 500 people who've lost everything and were lucky to have escaped with their lives. It's a grim spectacle to look down on. Yes, battered brickwork, twisted iron, and smoldering ruins. The devastation that was Lura's main street. And on the ground itself, the horror is starkly magnified. This is Lura Mell, and just here, 8 homes in a row have been reduced to charred, tangled debris. A life works lost in a few fiery minutes. What tales of personal tragedy could these ruins tell? Of hopes dashed, of wasted sweat and toil. And what a Christmas present for the youngsters, searching through the rubble for a favorite toy that is gone forever. Someone lived here yesterday. Youngsters romped in the rooms, and our sad-eyed parents rummaged through the debris in a hopeless salvage quest. The chimney stands, and the rest is ruin. Multiply the scene 150 times, and that is the loss in the mountains. The Shadow Napier Guest House, a 50-bedroom mansion, a showplace for holidaymakers, gone. There's nowhere to go except home to search among the ruins. A small hospital, the fire didn't spare it either. The old, the young, the sick. The bushfire is no respecter of persons. This man refused to leave, and now he sifts through the rubble. He's found what he's looking for, and he can smile again. Shops destroyed, their stocks burned to ashes, and the kiddies' playthings lying where they were abandoned when the youngsters were snatched to safety. Nuns come back to the ruins of a church hall. The fires still rage, the danger still threatens, so the men of the mountains still stand guard, and the women stand and pray.
One of the most disastrous days in Australia's history was February 7, 1967, when bushfires consumed much of the southwest of Tasmania, penetrating to within 2 kilometres of the centre of Hobart. Extreme temperatures, high-velocity winds and tinder-dry terrain made the firefighters' job impossible. Winds of up to 80 kilometres an hour drove flames down Mount Wellington and onto Hobart. 62 people died that day, hundreds suffered varying degrees of injury, and property losses numbered 1,400 buildings and 1,500 cars. Total losses were estimated at $40 million. Some areas of the world are more susceptible to certain types of disasters than others. Since Australia is the Earth's driest continent, it is only natural that part of it will be found to be in the grip of drought at some time each year. During a major national drought between 1918 and 1920, some pastoralists brought their sheep to Sydney and grazed them in suburban Centennial Park. Sheep losses in New South Wales alone during this period numbered 10 million. While the economy of the entire nation suffers when the country is in drought, it is the man on the land who always feels it most. Not only does he have to endure the heartbreak of seeing his stock perish and his crops wither and die due to the lack of rain, but in some cases he also has to stand by helplessly as his land is then eaten away by the resultant soil erosion.
The good earth, true foundation of our civilization. Of the earth, water is the closest friend and the most merciless enemy. Water brings life to the soil, and water uncontrolled sucks out and sweeps away forever its fertility. This is the story of erosion by water, the tragedy of today which can resolve itself into the national calamity of tomorrow. When vegetation protects the surface, rain is absorbed, does no damage. Falling onto the litter of the forest floor, it soaks. What runs off takes no soil. But on loose, unprotected earth, water is the deadly destroyer. It sweeps the precious topsoil from fallowed wheatlands and from overgrazed hillsides. It cuts channels of ruin into the face of plenty. The water carries that precious earth to silt up valuable rivers. Many of our too few streams are being destroyed. As the river shallows, it has a tendency to spread, undermining its banks. That was fertile farm soil. Now it is useless mud choking a river. Abandoned bridge. Because the river bottom was raised by siltation, the bridge became useless. The new higher level bridge in the background replaced it, but it too will become useless if siltation goes on. The once beautiful deep Hunter River. A storage reservoir choked with soil from an eroding catchment area. That is what we should preserve. Riverbanks safely held by trees and vegetation. Nature undisturbed is doing the job. When man interferes with nature's balance, this happens. We have shockingly exploited the virgin richness of our land. The topsoil from the higher paddock is lodged against the fence. Treeless farms are in the majority. The next step is soilless farms, and the next, destitute farmers. It's happening. Here's tragic proof. And not in the never-never country, but 40 miles from Sydney. City men and countrymen alike will pay a terrible price if we don't do something about it. We are losing by erosion vast tracts of our country. Our kith and kin are at this moment shedding their blood to save. It is as bad as that. What is being done about it? Not yet enough. New South Wales government has set up a soil conservation service directed by E.S. Clayton. This research station at Cowra is Australia's first, and farmers from all over the Commonwealth attend. Nothing misses the eye of Premier McKell, an ardent conservationist. They watch skilled men tackling this insidious land cancer by scientific methods. Meteorological instruments for measuring the rainfall intensities which cause the worst erosion. These are test plots with apparatus to measure the runoff and loss of soil under various conditions. The discolored water tells the story of soil content. Soil in the silt box is accurately measured and the runoff water computed and sampled. Grassed waterways for safe disposal of runoff water. Dense pasture is used to protect the soil. Slope erosion is being cured by contour banks and channels on grades. We have passed the stage of exploitation. Now we must farm for permanence or we shall decline. The first cut in preparation of a contour bank with specially designed ploughing gear made in Australia to American pattern. The wheels lean to withstand the thrust when ploughing diagonally across a slope. The newly constructed bank with a channel on the uphill side to carry off excess water, sideways, not downwards. A typical hillside after corrective treatment. Contour furrows protect and reclaim eroded pasture lands. Small dams in the furrows prevent collection of water at weak spots. This is a land of plenty. Nature has been generous, yet millions of acres of our country are washing away. Even with war at our doors, the foundation of the huge task ahead must be laid. And only with a full public consciousness of the problem can it be thoroughly attacked. We have in Australia far more urgent problems than beer, Sunday shows, excessive gambling. Erosion strikes at our very existence. We must quickly decide what the future will hold for us and for posterity. This or this. The answer is up to us.
1935 saw the beginning of another major national drought which lasted 9 years, peaking in 1938, 1940 and 1944. Many areas experienced their worst conditions ever, as these graphic newsreels show.
What does drought news really mean to the man who is remote from drought? Does it mean, well, that's too bad. And a quick turnover to the more interesting news? Or does it mean this? Desolation, death, ruin. Large sections of Australia are affected by drought, called by Federal Minister for Agriculture Scully one of the most tragic in the nation's history. One of the areas severely stricken is the once fertile and flourishing riverina country. Like an oasis in its parched centre is Yanco irrigation area. Still green, still feeding stock and growing crops. Because water is provided. Crops are very fair, stock remain fat. Water, forethought in conserving water, is the answer. That is how the country looks not 10 miles out of the irrigation area. And even then, black and white photography softens the grey-brown bleakness of it all. In 1,000 homesteads, man himself is at the end of his water resources, and from fast-drying water holes must draw supplies. The paddocks beyond the homestead tell a tragic story of death and desolation. To complete the destruction of what little feed remains, come clouds of grasshoppers breeding in tens of millions, devouring anything they can find. On that country, there isn't even feed for grasshoppers. Bare paddocks and crops that have failed. Australia's wheat harvest this year will be only 55 million bushels, against 210 million bushels in 1939-40. In Narrandera, thousands of tons of precious grain burns in a silo. The damaged wheat is sold by auction back to the farmers as feed for their starving stock. Properties which still have stored fodder hand feed their flocks. Others, less fortunate, must either move them out of the area, if possible, or watch them slowly starve to death. Already 1.25 million sheep and cattle have died in the riverina alone. An example of an overstocked paddock and a rested paddock in dry feed even in drought. The comparison is obvious. Overstocking is a calamitous gamble in which the gambler must lose if the season is dry. The average annual rainfall at Jerilderie, Central Riverina, is 15 inches a year. To the end of September this year, only 4.5 inches have fallen. Families are being forced off their holdings. 2 years of the worst drought since 1902 has made the battle to take a living from the land a little too tough. It isn't easy for a man to give up his home, to walk out on years of hard work and try and start afresh somewhere else. The gods of the weather exact a pretty grim price from the man who lives from the land. Drought is grim, brutal, and desperately hard to grapple with. The partial devastation of this paddock is the result of erosion when it had water. When rains come again, water erosion will be heavy because the land is unprotected by grass and surface vegetation. The water washes away the fruitful surface soil, tears great gullies in the pasture, rendering large areas of it useless. If erosion goes uncontrolled, then it's only a question of time. There are two types of soil erosion, by water and by wind. Both are grave menaces. That was a crop in the drought area. Now it is part of a potential dust bowl. Wind whips the surface soil away from the roots of the stunted crop. It takes it too from the very roots of the trees. Most of the surface soil gone, leaving small oases. They will go too. Farmlands are literally blowing away, and the subsurface soil which is left is comparatively valueless. At Condobolin Government Station, saltbush and other shrubs are grown to replant the devastated land. It is directed by scientist Dr. Beadle, and results are already being achieved with the land-saving seedlings. Comparison of how the natural surface vegetation will hold the priceless topsoil against the wind even in the driest periods. Listen for a minute to a countryman.
I speak as a farmer. Land devastation and erosion is largely due to ignorance and exploitation. Over-destruction of natural timbers and herbage, plus overstocking of the land, is the primary cause of soil erosion by wind and water. If we continue to flog the productive earth to death for a little more profit, posterity will pay a bitter price. It isn't all the farmer's fault. Too often the pressure of economic conditions and powerful financial pressure have compelled the farmer to overstock his country. That is fatal. If we do not turn from exploitation to conservation, we shall, without question, destroy our national heritage.
The bare, parched earth, the land of milk and honey, can become a desert, and drought is not entirely to blame. Man's misuse of the land, and in some cases his ruthless exploitation of it, portends the dangers of tomorrow. Even rabbits die of hunger and thirst. We cannot avoid occasional drought, but we can do much to control it by water conservation plus land conservation. Undeniably, that is the major post-war job for Australians. In northwest New South Wales, the sands of the desert creep eastward, creep up to good properties, creep over them, forced inexorably on by the wind that comes from the west. Again, the reason is destruction of the natural herbage which for millions of years has held back the sand. This was a homestead. This was a township. The surface soil has gone in a red pall blowing towards the sea. The sand is coming in, and the men and women who had wrestled with this country have moved on. Back in the Riverina, a dust storm is gathering. The wind sweeps over thousands of acres wide open to attack. It gathers up the surface soil, generally only 6 to 9 inches deep, and sweeps it away. It's gone, not temporarily, but for good. Americans rose up unitedly and fought its Dust Bowl problem. It has not yet conquered the evil, but great forward strides have been made. We Australians must do the same, because we have exactly the same problem. Millions and millions of sheep on the move powder the dry soil into dust. The rest is easy for a high wind. We and our descendants want to live here permanently and farm the good earth for permanence. For the earth in the long run supports our cities and our secondary industries too. It is not too much to say that if we do not face up to and meet this problem determinedly, then the future of our nation is at stake.
life has always been difficult for those who live on the land. As if drought and soil erosion were not enough, farmers have also had to contend with attacks on their livelihood from feral animals and insect hordes, which, given the right conditions, reach plague proportions at various times. By 1938, the marsupial on Australia's coat of arms had been declared a pest. The kangaroo had increased its population to an unmanageable level, and farmers could no longer stand by and see their fences wrecked and crops and pastures ravaged. Kangaroos could eat 6 times as much as sheep, so a concentrated campaign of eradication was undertaken. Kangaroo hunting was no longer a sport, it had become a business, a necessary business if graziers were to survive. When common European rabbits were imported into Australia in 1859, they were allowed to breed uncontrolled. They became a popular delicacy on the tables of Australian society, and in the early part of this century, they were trapped and killed for their furs. But by the 1930s, rabbits had become a national disaster and were causing grave concern among the farming community. Netting for fences was scarce, and the rabbits roamed and multiplied at random, destroying thousands of hectares of rich pastoral land as they ate their way across the country. In the 1940s, drives were organised where thousands of rabbits were trapped and destroyed, but this had little effect on the rabbit population as a whole. Farmers tried poisoning, trapping and shooting, all to no avail. By 1950, the rabbit plague was starting to threaten the nation's livelihood, so authorities reluctantly agreed to trial a new virus called myxomatosis. Myxomatosis was a particularly horrible virus. It would take more than a week for the agony it inflicted to kill an infected rabbit. In the meantime, when the conditions were right, the disease would spread to other rabbits by fleas and mosquitoes. As a result, rabbits began dying in their millions, and the pastoral lands they had decimated were restored in a few short years. But the bane of all farming communities has always been the plagues of grasshoppers that swarm in their millions somewhere in Australia each summer. These scenes were filmed in 1953 as grasshoppers devastated some of the finest country in western New South Wales and northern Victoria. Travelling 40 kilometres between dusk and dawn, they devoured everything in their path. Trees were stripped of their leaves and crops crumbled as they were eaten to the ground. All that remained was scorched earth where once were lush pastures. The farmers fought back, spreading deadly insecticides provided by the Pastures Protection Board in an attempt to wipe out the plague, but it was a losing battle. The ground was literally crawling with the insects, and they were hatching out at the rate of 10,000 a day. During the 19th century in outback Queensland, a pioneer placed a plant in his garden. A plant that was destined to become the scourge of the state's vast rural area and almost bring its farming community to its knees. The plant was a prickly pear, and with the help of wandering cattle and birds, particularly emus and crows, it spread throughout Queensland and northern New South Wales at the rate of 1 million hectares a year. By 1925, the pear had infested more than 60 million hectares of prime pastoral and agricultural land, an area greater than the state of Victoria. To combat this menace, the Commonwealth Prickly Pear Board was established in 1920. It set up a research laboratory, and after years of searching experiments, introduced a moth called the Cactoblastus, which had been imported from South America. It was found that the Cactoblastus laid its eggs in the spines of the pear, and when the young caterpillars hatched, they immediately burrowed into the plant, where they remained, eating it away from the inside until the plant was completely destroyed. It was also discovered that the Cactoblastus only attacked prickly pear, so the moth was released, and by 1929, valuable land that had looked like this in 1926 had been rescued from the grip of the plague, which had become known as the green octopus. The early 1960s saw a plague of flying foxes threaten orchards in the Clarence River district near Grafton in New South Wales. The large fruit bats had established a breeding ground on nearby Susan Island, and as the island was a sanctuary, the flying foxes were protected and their numbers quickly increased to plague proportions. Estimates at the time placed their numbers in millions, and these nocturnal creatures presented an awesome sight as they took off from the island in the early evening each day in search of food. Local farmers and orchardists sustained heavy losses as the flying fox's diet included tree blossoms and all kinds of cultivated fruit. In 1953, agricultural authorities were stunned to learn that the Queensland fruit fly had spread to Victoria. The infestation, which was discovered in fruit and vegetables in the Surrey Hills district, was thought to have been introduced in tropical fruit sent from Queensland. All fruit and vegetables taken from Surrey Hills was drenched with DDT and then dumped in a quarry to be buried under a metre of earth. But more stringent action was required to prevent the spread of fruit fly to other areas of the state, so the government introduced the Victorian Fruit Fly Act, and war was declared on one of Australia's most destructive pests.
At Wodonga, near the New South Wales-Victorian border, roadblocks check cars and trucks 24 hours a day. It's not a search for escaped convicts. It's part of a nationwide war on fruit fly. All fruit being carried into Victoria is examined, and if there's a telltale fruit fly puncture in it, it's destroyed. In this war, there can't be any half measures. Australia produces fruit worth millions of pounds each year. It's an industry too valuable to be lost by carelessness. Wodonga is only one of many checkpoints. Essendon and Mildura airports are proclaimed areas under the Victorian Fruit Fly Act, and it's against the law to remove fruit from those areas without the permission of a fruit inspector. Of course, the risk of spreading fruit fly would decrease if people didn't take fruit interstate. The damage done by this menace in Australia is already well known to home gardeners. But the pest now threatens areas which have been free, and that could endanger not only the home market, but also Australia's valuable export trade. So war on the fly is nationwide. No fruit may be taken into the Murrumbidgee irrigation area. No fruit may be taken across the border of South Australia. And all fruit entering Victoria and Tasmania is subject to the strictest inspection. In Sydney and Melbourne, trained inspectors examine fruit arriving at the city markets, taking samples of fruit from different orchards and districts. The orchardist may not suspect that the fly has struck, but the inspectors make no such mistake, and any fruit found to be infested is earmarked for immediate destruction. Burying fly-struck fruit achieves nothing. The furnace is the only sure method of destruction. But despite the strictest precautions and the wholesale incineration of fruit containing the fly, the Commonwealth and states' quarantine services are still worried. The fruit fly is public enemy number one. It lays eggs inside the ripening fruit, not in the blossoms. In areas where it's established, control measures are compulsory. In every area where it appears, steps are taken to eradicate it. Commonwealth and state departments are trying to enlist your support in preventing its spread. One neglected tree menaces fruit for miles around. People who travel receive pamphlets and stickers from motorists' organizations appealing for their cooperation. They're asked not to carry fruit interstate. The fruit you carry may look all right, but the entire produce of Australia's orchards is at stake. The mass destruction of infested fruit will be useless. The airport and roadblock inspections defeated if one piece of fruit carrying eggs gets through. Every Australian government asks the travelling public to declare war on the fruit fly.
It's an interesting irony that the crown of thorns starfish was looked upon as nothing more than an ocean oddity in the 1920s.
In spite of its many arms and innumerable feet, it makes slow progress. Not surprising when one knows that each foot has to be pumped full of water before it can be used. The feet highly magnified. Each ends in a tiny suction disc, which enables it to cling to the rocks it moves upon.
But by 1970, it was realized that the crown of thorns starfish was more than just a creature you avoided stepping on. It was a monster that was thoroughly and systematically destroying one of the world's most beautiful wilderness areas, Australia's Great Barrier Reef. Hundreds of kilometres of coral reef south of Cairns were killed as a result of the spiny starfish infestation. Although they moved forward slowly, one creature alone could devour up to 1,000 square centimetres of coral each day. One of the problems of the Crown of Thorns menace was that it was almost indestructible. If it was cut up, each part grew and thrived as a separate entity. Despite warnings from ecologists, there had been no sustained effort to save the Great Barrier Reef by 1973, and the dreaded scourge continued to move forward uninhibited, slowly leaving a coral graveyard in its wake. Although earthquake activity in Australia is relatively low, there have been a number of violent tremors of significant size that have caused considerable damage and death during the 20th century. On October 14, 1968, the Western Australian town of Meckering was hit by a quake measuring 6.9 on the Richter scale. Although there was no loss of life, 21 people were injured and every building in the town was either damaged or destroyed. The cost was estimated at $2.5 million. But Australia's most destructive earthquake struck the New South Wales city of Newcastle at 10:27 a.m. on Thursday, December 28, 1989. The quake lasted 10 seconds and measured 5.5 on the Richter scale. Within minutes, Newcastle was a city in chaos. The central business district was one of the worst hit areas. It was here that 3 floors of the Newcastle Workers' Club collapsed. Being pension day, the club was packed with elderly people. 9 of the 13 people who lost their lives in the earthquake died in the ruins of the Workers' Club. Most of the buildings in the Newcastle business district suffered some degree of structural damage, some of it major and requiring demolition. Police blocked off the city centre, and because of the danger of possible aftershocks, people were ordered to evacuate and keep to open spaces. Power supplies were cut throughout most of the Hunter region as the quake shook towns right throughout New South Wales and was felt as far away as Melbourne and Tasmania. It was the worst earthquake in Australia's history, with 13 people confirmed dead and more than 160 hurt, some of them sustaining shocking injuries. The damage was estimated to have exceeded $1 billion. Australia's vast river system has always been the lifeblood of the nation. Right from the early days of the colony, towns and farms have been established along the banks of rivers as they not only provided the precious water necessary for survival, but in many cases, the only means of transport and communication with the outside world. But the tranquil lifestyles of these communities have been shattered from time to time as the rivers they have relied on for their existence have suddenly risen in flood to terrify and engulf them, leaving a trail of destruction and heartbreak in their wake. Throughout the 20th century, Australia has seen entire districts transformed into inland lakes as swollen rivers have broken their banks, sending surging torrents of muddy water rampaging through the countryside. In 1955, a prolonged cyclonic depression brought unprecedented rainfall to a vast area of New South Wales, causing the worst flooding in Australia's history. For the second time in 6 years, the town of Maitland fell victim to raging floodwaters as the Hunter River broke its banks again. Men, women and children worked desperately to build sandbag levees in an attempt to keep the floodwaters out of the town, but the odds were hopeless. Hours of labour went undone in seconds as the levees broke through, sending a fast and furious wall of water through the streets, tearing at buildings, homes and shops. Within 24 hours, the water level reached 11 metres, and the position became critical as the main bridge into the town was completely covered. 15,000 people in the Maitland district were homeless, and there was no choice. They had to evacuate. Families grabbed what few possessions they could as willing helpers aided their escape. In 6 days, the flood caused damage estimated at $10 million. 24 lives were lost, 19 were drowned and 5 electrocuted. The main street of Maitland, a scene of terror and destruction that had to be seen to be believed. A scene of loss and human misery that was repeated in every town and village throughout the stricken area. Government and private resources throughout the nation combined to relieve the plight of the thousands of homeless refugees, distributing blankets, clothing and food, as well as urgent medicine to ward off the threat of disease. As skiffs, army ducks and surf boats were brought in to join in the mammoth rescue effort, police, soldiers and surf club members risked their lives in the raging torrent. A number of men sought refuge from the floodwaters in this railway signal box, but it proved a death trap as the signal box collapsed and the men were thrown into the torrent. 2 of them were able to grab a helicopter's lifeline and were being flown to safety when their strength failed and they fell. 1 landed on high-tension wires and died instantly. The second disappeared into the swirling waters. Then the helicopter also hit the wires and crashed. Army ducks miraculously rescued the crew, who were wearing life jackets, 2 kilometres downriver. When the floodwaters eventually subsided, more than 30 people were missing, and it was more than a week before they were all accounted for. But it would be months before Maitland could return to any semblance of its normal life. Death and destruction struck Brisbane in January 1974 when a freak flood engulfed almost a third of the city's metropolitan area. 40 suburbs were underwater, some of them to an amazing depth of more than 10 metres. 15 people died, scores were injured, and many thousands had to be evacuated from their homes. As torrential rains brought on by Cyclone Wanda continued to fall, the Brisbane River rose to its highest level this century, flowing over into the city's business centre. This oil tanker eventually broke its moorings in the flooded river and narrowly missed a block of flats before crashing into a wharf. It was Brisbane's worst disaster in 80 years. During the 1950s, the North Queensland town of Bowen was hit by 2 major cyclones in 10 months, both of which devastated the town and caused many millions of dollars damage.
Bowen, a thriving Queensland port almost wrecked in a night of horror. Lashed by a cyclone with winds reaching 112 miles an hour, £2 million worth of damage is done in less than 4 hours. 47 homes are wrecked, more than 200 seriously damaged, and nearly 400 more need repairs in the town area alone. A church wrecked beyond repair. The homeless queue for blankets. People who've lost everything and have to be evacuated until the town rebuilds. Roofs are blown hundreds of yards, and the search for precious belongings is a pitiful and often futile business. Houses held sideways by the fury of the cyclone, the theatre destroyed, and the town's saltworks reduced to a heap of twisted, mangled wreckage. Only 1 man died, a miracle in a town where splintered buildings, broken glass and flying iron from roofs could have caused heavy casualties. At the airfield, an oyster and a moth are flung upside down and snapped like carrots. It's a nightmare Bowen will never forget. Fewer than 300 homes in the town escaped the fury of the cyclone that swept in from the sea and hammered Bowen into a scene of indescribable havoc, the greatest disaster of its kind in Australia's history. 4 frightful hours that destroy a life's work and leave a £2 million trail of devastation.
But cyclones not only cause damage in Australia's north. In 1948, the South Australian coastline was hit by hurricane-force winds reaching a velocity of 140 kilometres an hour. The giant waves whipped up by the gale destroyed Adelaide's Glenelg Pier, leaving the aquarium isolated on piles out in the bay. The Navy survey ship HMAS Barcoo was dragged from its moorings and blown onto the beach, presenting the Navy with its biggest job of salvage that year. In 1957, Cyclone Clara, after hovering off the North Queensland coast for over a week, began moving south, leaving a trail of destruction along the entire east coast. Flood warnings were issued for towns in the north of New South Wales, while in Sydney, winds of up to 100 kilometres an hour caused some of the worst damage in the city's history. Giant 12-metre waves pounded the coastline, threatening buildings along the beachfront, while torrential rain brought widespread flooding to coastal suburbs. Stormwater outlets overflowed and traffic became stranded in flooded streets. Residents in Doncaster Avenue at Kensington stood ankle-deep in water as the flood inundated their homes. A man and his wife were killed when this tree fell during the gale, crushing their Northern Beaches home. 5 of the couple's 9 children who were sleeping in the house survived. All ports along the coast were closed except Sydney. Even in Sydney Harbour, Manly ferries struggled as enormous waves swept in through the heads. As Clara continued to move down the New South Wales coast, Sydney was left to take stock of the damage caused by one of the worst periods of cyclonic gales and deluges in the city's history. In 1962, a 190-kilometre-an-hour cyclone roared into the town of Carnarvon, leaving a trail of damage along 1,300 kilometres of Western Australian coast. Striking at midnight, the cyclone completely devastated the town. Families who sheltered in the new school returned to their homes the next morning to find them in ruins. Although the cyclone was expected, no one thought it would be the worst in the town's history. Newsreel coverage of the disaster flippantly remarked that this man had had a close shave, but there was nothing to laugh about as hundreds of homes had been wrecked in the same way as this one. The district's banana industry was also wiped out, the roaring winds flattening plantations that were just in their prime. But the most devastating disaster ever to strike an Australian city occurred on Christmas Day 1974, when the full ferocity of Tropical Cyclone Tracy hit Darwin. Although Tracy was considered small, it was severe, recording surface wind speeds of 217 kilometres an hour. The city was battered by these destructive winds for about 6 hours, causing damage estimated at $400 million. About 90% of Darwin's homes were completely destroyed. 50 people were killed as the cyclone cut its path of destruction across the city. A further 19 lives were lost at sea. Darwin was cut off from the rest of Australia for several hours. When communications were eventually restored, the full extent of the disaster began to emerge. Such was the extent of the devastation that most of the population was forced to leave Darwin, leaving behind the stark reality of what was arguably the greatest disaster Australia has ever experienced.